Okay, so welcome to program 2 of In the Mind of Theist. I'm joined here with Dharsh, how long have you been a student here?
I've been studying here for 2.5 years.
Okay, excellent. And how long have you been a Christian?
I grew up in a Christian family, but I came to faith for myself in my early teenage years.
Okay, excellent. So with how would you say that you became a true Christian in that respect? Like, would you say that when you were a child it was sort of more of a family belief and you had an experience, or was it something that you logically came to the conclusion of?
Well, I'd go to church with my family my whole life, and so I was used to church and I was aware of the presence of God in my life. But it would have been probably in my early teenage years when I saw God really at work in my life, as I prayed for things and I saw stuff happening, as I felt Him reveal Himself more to me through His Word and through the work of the Holy Spirit in my own life, and helping me to come to a place where I wanted to claim this faith as my own and be like, this is not just my parents' faith, but it's my faith as well, because I've seen God at work, I've seen the reality of Him, and therefore I want in on this.
Okay, excellent. So I'm just going to do some sort of fundamental questions
Sure.
just to sort of not set the tone, but set the stage, if you will.
Sure.
All right. So first, I'm just asking, what is science? How do you define science?
For me, I see science as a subject which is primarily studied in academia, and it explains a lot of the natural laws around us. It explains a lot of pretty much of all things that are around us, so we can better understand what's going on. However, I also do strongly believe that there is a very strong correlation between theology and science, and that from the Christian view, I'd actually get up and I'd say that it is a way how God has enabled us to better understand, perhaps in a more nuanced or a lensed sense, what He's actually doing and how He's at work.
Okay.
We maybe can't see infrared, but if we understand some of the physical properties around it, we can better understand the concept, even though it can be quite abstract.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great
And I
answer.
actually reckon that pretty much all the different science disciplinarians, whether you're going from zoology or botany straight through to nuclear, chemical engineering understanding, or physics or astrophysics and things, you can literally see, you better understand what's going on around you. But as a Christian, I'd say they would even point you in a way that will keep pointing towards God, because science will not show us something that is contrary to God. Science, I would actually say, would actually cause us to better understand God and see what He's doing, who He is, and how He's at work in this world.
So would you say that in that regard, that science is an understanding of sort of a material world and theology would be the understanding of an immaterial? So they're sort of two sides of the same coin.
I'd actually say that both would interconnect with each other.
Okay.
Because there are aspects of the immaterial world that science can also explain.
Yes.
Things that we can't necessarily see, but we understand. I can't see a sound wave.
Yes.
Yes, and while I recognize it is a physical property, there's also a dimension there that I cannot fully comprehend, such as how do we even hear it anyway?
Okay.
Leaving aside the anatomy of the human or the animal.
Okay.
So there are bits and pieces there. At the same time, there are things in the physical property which I can say, what theology actually fits into this, because it explains how it came to be. It explains it. So I think the two really complement each other really beautifully, and even interconnect with each other. I do think you'd have both in a balance, and even then you can't distinctly separate one from the other too much.
Okay, no, that's actually a really good answer. So the next question is, does this align with your belief system? But I think that's already answered.
I think it does. I would like to say that as a Christian, I would want to also look to see where the two interconnect. I do believe that, as much as I am a theist, I also do believe in the role of science.
Yes.
So if, for example, science is going to come and give me physical, geological proof about the creation of the world in terms of the age of rocks or the age of fossils,
Yes.
I would like that to educate my understanding of theology.
Okay.
I don't want to necessarily be like, well, science is this and theology says, therefore I'll jump on the theology bandwagon all the way. I would want to use the science knowledge that I have access to, and that is part of my education and part of my development as a human being in this world, to better influence my theology. So I find that science will actually can serve that purpose as well. Sure, there are things that maybe I can't understand completely, and maybe it's not there, but I'll accept in faith both the science of it, even though I may not fully get it or understand a physics formula, a chemical combination, as much as I would my theology.
That's excellent. So the next question is, define God. So what would your, let's say somebody has never even heard of the idea of God. Well, we'll make them an adult, because usually when it's a kid in this situation, it's like, well, we'll think of a really simplistic way, but let's say there's an adult who comes from a completely atheistic society that has never even comprehended of God. How would you explain God to them?
Wow. I'm not sure if I can do it very simply.
I don't think anybody can. It's like...
It's good to know. The way how I'd explain God is that he is the supreme being. He has been there always. He's sovereign. That means he's boss. He's king over the universe. He's the one who creates. He's the one who puts things in their place. But he doesn't just exist in and of himself. He exists in triune relationship of spirit and of humanity, especially through the incarnation of Jesus. So it's very much a triune God there, who exists in relationship. And that might not make a lot of sense, but then again, a lot of us who are Christians, we find it hard to completely differentiate and define every single aspect of the Trinity of the God that we worship. But that's okay. We accept that in faith because we've seen how God revealed himself to us.
Okay.
But anyway, back to the original question. In terms of who God is there. He is real. We may not always see how he's at work, but he's at work. And the God of the Christians, the God who we worship, he's a God who's in relationship with his creation. He doesn't just create, do and leave it on its own. He interacts with it. He's separate from it, but he also cares for all that he's created. He cares for animals. He cares for people. The Bible tells us that humanity is the pinnacle of his creation, and that he seeks relationship with us. And so, as a result, in that respect of God, he does want relationship with people. He wants to engage and interact with them. He wants to be able to support people, and he's there and he's real.
Yeah. No, excellent.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. All right, so slight interruption, but we're back on track. Okay, so the first sort of question I've received is, provide one person who met Jesus, wrote about it, and whose existence is confirmed outside of the Bible.
Can you please repeat the question?
Okay, so outside of the Bible, outside of the Holy Scriptures, do any historical documents, do any historical writers even mention Jesus?
There are a lot of people who have actually encountered Jesus for themselves in their life and who've actually written about it. Now, I don't know how far back you'd want to go to make it to deem it a historical thing, but there have actually been publications of people who had an encounter with Jesus, maybe people who didn't come from a Christian background, who suddenly met Jesus one day and who were convicted and changed because he revealed who he was to them. There are, in particular, there are a lot of former Muslims who have done that, a lot of former atheists, people who were perhaps part of, who were persuaded by communism or Marxist ideals who have met Jesus. Unfortunately, I can't think of any names off the top of my head, but there are plenty of people. If you do a search for Christian biographies and a lot of bits and pieces, you will actually find a lot of people from across the world who encountered Jesus, and that's what made the difference. I think from a biblical perspective, because there've been a lot of checks and balances done in terms of accounts and things as to what actually got into the Bible through church history, we tend to jump on those names quickly and to remember them off the top of our heads. But even if you search back through the records, you will find different people. An example might be even like the Emperor Constantine, who had a vision and who came across God and what it was revealed to him, and he brought about change in the Roman Empire around 300 AD. There are plenty of people since then who have also had those sort of encounters, and I would actually say to the person who actually wrote to actually answer this question, it's a great question that you've asked, and I'd encourage you, go and do some research, have a look and see, because Christianity is not just a faith that belonged to an age, say 2,000 years ago, where everything was just done and dusted in the Bible. The Christian faith is a living faith. God is very much at work in this world by his Spirit, and he reveals himself to people. And I mean, the fact that people actually bother to get down and write about it. Even they may not be popular. I can't even remember their names, but people have actually been changed by this. They've had an encounter which has radically changed their life, and their sharing it has been there to encourage other people about the truth of it. So yeah, I just encourage this person, just go do some research as well, and because you will, if you could get a list of every single person who has encountered Jesus, written it down, whether it's like a blog post, a Facebook status, a book, a documentary series, whatever it is, it would be, I would dare say it would be maybe more than even the biggest library in the ancient world could even hold.
Okay, so would you say, just as a sort of a continuation of that question, for those people who have had visions of, well, first I should probably establish, would you say they physically met Jesus, or is it more of a spiritual sort of thing?
I think it's different things for different people. I mean, for some people, how they have encountered God, you may be maybe not down in like the words of science, like scientific proof, the way how I can touch a car, touch Jesus sort of a thing. Whereas for other people, they've actually seen a physical manifestation where they literally felt him hug them or hold them, where they've actually maybe even touched his hand and seen the scars of the nails. So when it comes to vision and encounter with Jesus, God works in so many different ways. My encounter with God will be different to Tim's encounter with God. It will be different to someone else's encounter with God. And we can't discredit someone's encounter just because it may not necessarily have been what happened to us, or we maybe can't necessarily prove it by scientific means, because God is so much bigger than how one person would engage with him. And I realize that, and he works in different ways for different people. You might have, I would not be surprised if Jesus literally was physically manifested, introduced himself to someone who genuinely needed physical, hard, evidential proof. For someone else who maybe is into like a lot of mysticism and stuff, maybe God would choose to reveal himself to them in a dream. But that is no less real in any way, shape, or form.
So, with sort of the extension to this question is, with those sort of events, we have people who claim to have been abducted, who have claimed to see the face of Muhammad, who have claimed to feel Takahata Buddha or Bast or Set or various other gods. Would you say that those are equal manifestations because of their sort of, well, they'd be equal to the Jesus manifestation? So, for instance, a lot of Muslims will say something like, I was a Christian and then I fell on my knees and I saw Muhammad, or I saw Allah and I realized that Islam was one true faith. So would those be equivalent, or would those have sort of be a stumbling block in that sort of revelation?
That's a really hard question, because there are two sides how I would say this. First of all, I wouldn't want to discredit anyone's experience, because your experience is your experience, and no one has the right to judge. I would want to say that straight up. So in that respect, I don't want to get up and say, this is right, this is wrong, or whatever. However, I also would want to say that as a Christian, I am biased because I believe that my God is real. Yes. I have seen God work in my own life. I can testify to that. I've seen it work in other people's life. I can testify to that. So I personally would hold more credibility if Jesus had revealed himself to someone than say Muhammad had, or Buddha had, or something.
Of course.
But at the same time, I would also say that God, who knows how people seek after him, even if you don't fully get it yourself or understand how you're thinking in your own heart or your mind, God longs for those who seek after him. So he loves seekers. We're all seekers. As people, we seek. We want to know. We want to know what our purpose is. We want to know where we're going. And God will take and use anyone's journey. So if you are seeking after God, and maybe you don't even know what God you're seeking, or maybe you want to change, maybe you're thinking, well, I grew up, like, for example, a Hindu, but I want to try and pursue something different. Keep seeking after God. Ask God to reveal himself to you. Call his bluff. Literally, I kid you not.
I'm going to use that. I like that.
God honors those who seek after him. If God seeks relationship. The Christian God, he seeks relationship. He's made himself known. And he keeps on wanting relationship with all people. because they're created in his image. And there's nothing God loves more, even than like a broken, messed up prayer like, God, if you're there, show yourself to me. Make yourself known. And God will honor that. If you pray, don't, even if someone prayed it for a joke, God might even call their bluff and do something.
I see.
But if you are a genuine seeker, I'd urge you, ask God to show himself to you. Ask Jesus to reveal himself to you. And because an honest prayer is one that God honors and that he answers.
I almost want to rename this, I guess you'd call it a podcast, Calling God's Bluff, because I like that. I like that phrase. It's good.
You would be surprised how many people set out to prove God wrong, he didn't exist. And I'm not saying this in any way to be cocky or boastful of Christians, because it's with deep humility and humbleness we recognize that God has revealed himself to us. But there are plenty of people there who didn't believe in God and who set out to prove that he wasn't real. And they end up meeting a guy called Jesus, and that changed their life. And I don't think it was in any way intended to be a joke, but I think God was like, you know what, they want an encounter, I will provide one.
No, that's excellent. I mean, I once was feeling dark, and I met a guy called Jesus. And he introduced me to the wonderful world of black tar heroin. It was excellent. No, I'm kidding. All right, so I think that's enough for question one. I'll move on, even though that might get me in trouble with some of the people who's been asking these questions. I'm sorry, guys and girls. So the next question is about sort of creation. Why doesn't the Bible talk about how the universe and life on Earth actually came to be instead of telling a creation myth? So, for example, like, if we don't just look at the Bible, but there's other religions that have sort of a creation story that doesn't align with the evolution, the superheating of the world, the sort of Big Bang, all of those sort of things. So why in Genesis would they tell us that the world was created one way when scientifically and observably we see that it's created in an entirely different way? Was it all allegorical, or was it a literalist sort of thing?
There's a lot of debates between Christians about the level of allegory and literalism when it comes to the creation theory. It's not like we all believe the same thing. We have spilled enough ink and thrown enough punches between ourselves as we grapple to figure out how it is. To answer this question, I would actually challenge back and push and say that before there was science, there was God. And the fundamental aspect of creation is that it is done by God. It is created by him for his purposes. And as much as I respect science and evolution to a certain extent as well, I wouldn't necessarily hold them to be in the same category as God, because they weren't there when God was. That's the honest truth. As much as there has been great debate and scholarship and thought in these areas, when you compare it to God, these things are way younger. So to necessarily try to make it an even playing field in that way, you can't really do that. And I would actually get up and actually think that any other religion that had a creation story would say a similar thing as well, because essentially, if God is the one who creates, he's been there from the beginning, and he's done it his way for his purposes, and in that respect, he doesn't need to answer to science or to evolution why he's done things. I think it's great that we have fossil records. I think it's great that we are thinking through how we're similar to other creatures and how have we come about. I would actually further push back and say that I think a lot of things can effectively show God at work in these ways. When God put together the creation narrative, I don't think you were thinking, now I need to actually be doing data classification of how I came up with this, that, or anything, because one day someone will actually ask something. God, being God, does as he wills. He creates as he wills. Whether we like it or not, we have to accept that. And we've got to accept it on face value. That part of it comes through faith and trust. That doesn't mean that God discredits evolution or science, but I think that we're treading into very dangerous territory if we only focus on these things, which are in and of themselves disputed between scientists, between people of the academic mind and things. So that's just all I would want to caution back to this person who's asked this question.
Okay, so with the sort of, how to put it, with creation stories, there's quite a array of them. I mean, Christianity and sort of the Abrahamic creations are pretty straightforward. God just goes, it's there, and it's there.
Yep.
But we have others. We have an elephant riding on the back of a turtle. Mm-hmm. We have the entire universe being flattened out with a frying pan, which was great. We have a alien getting drunk and spilling beer on his controls, you know. But with something you said about the science wasn't there when God was there, could you attribute that in reverse to the Christians' own sort of perspective? Christians weren't there, so how do they disprove the Big Bang?
I've actually heard some Christians get up and say that the Big Bang, it could possibly be a way how God has actually brought about creation. I don't know a huge amount about science or a lot of the scientific bits and pieces to be able to conclusively say one way or the other. If God chose to use the Big Bang, then he chose to use the Big Bang. But that doesn't necessarily mean that God is any less a person who did creation as well. I think the danger for Christians has been, we have come up against attack from so many people who are like, oh no, it doesn't work this way, it's only a Big Bang and whatever.
I see.
There's some Christians have had to jump on a position where it's God, you believe it in faith, and screw the Big Bang, for lack of a better word. At the same time, the most important thing is that God created the world. Now, how he's gone about it, how long it took him to do it, which is some of the very big debates amongst Christians, Christian academics, Christian scientists, Christian scholars, Christian theologians, in terms of the nitty-gritty details, we have a lot of information, but some of those minuscule details we don't have. But that's not the point. As long as you believe that God created it, it's there. I would actually push back on some Christian and actually say, before you get them and say there was no Big Bang, there is evidence for science being at work, and there is a good chance that God actually did use things like the Big Bang to bring about some parts of his creation. And if God used the Big Bang, it doesn't mean that he's any less God. It doesn't discredit the Bible in any way. But I would also, just like a gentle reminder to myself as much as anyone else, the things we don't fully get, we accept it in faith, we accept it in face value, because we know the one whom we're putting our trust in. We know the one whom has created the world. We know the one whom holds everything together for his purposes. So we don't have to have everything figured out like a computer system or like Siri in ourselves. We don't have to, because we put our trust in one who is bigger than all that.
No, that's great. I think that's probably a sufficient answer. I'll wait that to the end. What is your response to, have you come across the problem of evil? I think everybody who studied here has. What would your response be to the problem with evil? I think it's something that sort of gets quite a few relatively new atheists. When I say new atheists, because I've actually had somebody in the comments ask this, I mean people who are newly becoming atheistic, somebody who's recently given up their faith. Just clarifying that in audio so people know. Anyway, it's something that a lot of new atheists deal with, because what happens is they read the Bible again, and they read it as a collection of stories and auditorial stories that have been written down, and they find that God has done quite a lot of atrocities, right? So, for instance, making Abraham try to sacrifice his son, etc., etc. And that's just in the Bible alone. If we look at the relative world, like why do kids get sick? Why are some people born in countries that won't hear about Christ, etc.? Anyway, I could go on for days about how many different things, but I'll just say, what would your response be to the problem of evil?
Well, I would think that any human being who's been alive longer than for about 5 minutes would have encountered evil in some way, shape, or form. You see it on the news, you see it around us. The truth is, and my friend, he might have to actually censor some of this, about what I'm about to actually say, is that the reality is that we live in a very broken world where bad shit happens.
Yes.
That's the honest truth. And some stuff is honestly, it's pretty fucked up. Honestly, it is. And I say that because we live in this world. We know the horrors that are going around. It's no it's no coincidence that we are in one of the most fearful ages where anxiety and other mental illnesses are high. People are stressed. People are buying insurance for even just to wake up the next day, almost, because we live in uncertain times. We live in a world where like I said, really horrible things happen, things that you can't explain, things that are beyond our comprehension. And and no matter what religion or no religion or where you fit in the whole God sphere thing, there is evil everywhere. As tempting as it would be to run away to Mars or to hide in a monastery in the hills of Tibet, to leave the world and not have evil there, it's everywhere. It's around us. From a Christian's perspective, evil brought about, and evil has it's disrupted the goodness of creation. No one is immune from evil. Even when Jesus was doing ministry here, he encountered evil. Sometimes he had to do a showdown with evil. And that's the reality for everybody there. Now, just because there's evil, it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. Some people actually think that if there is evil, it proves that God is not real, or that if they're on the flip side, if God is there, then there would not be no evil. There is nothing to suggest that the two cannot exist. And I would actually come and say that evil in many ways can be a subjective and relative term. What I might think is evil, someone else may not. However, how can you determine that unless you have something in which to actually measure it by? So, for example, as Christians, we believe in a good God who is sovereign and who is pure and who is just, in whom there is no evil. And we measure standards against that. Now, should we question the goodness of our God? Should we question even his existence? Then we have no right to get up and have like a list of morals and say this is bad because it's contrary to the morals and values of God. You take away a good God, then it means that you can't deem anything to be evil. It means that we can get up and say, it means that no one has the right to get up and say that injustices are unjust. You can't get up and say that pedophilia is wrong. You can't get up and say that ISIS running around is a good thing. People can say that because they have values, whether they wish to admit it or not. They have a moral system and a value code system in which you measure things by. Even things like discrimination, which is or tolerance, which have become massive buzzwords in popular vernacular of late. To be able to deem and determine that, you've got to measure it against something. Yep. If you don't have a moral code there in which to say something is evil, then you can't make that judgment. Yep. So I would actually want to point that stuff out. Do I think that I personally, as much as it's confusing and at hard at times, the reality of evil is there, but so is the reality of God. And for Christians, we believe that God has defeated evil. In the sense where through how he's been at work in his world, most notably through the death and resurrection of his son, the power of evil is no longer over people. The power of death is no longer over people. But as much as we hold on to that will not be manifested until the end of time, when Jesus really does come and kicks evil's butt once and for all and destroys it in and of itself. But that won't happen until he returns. So it's sort of like a now but a not yet sort of thing. Yeah. The victory's already been won. Evil has no power or control. As much as it might masquerade and think it's boss, it's not. But it's also recognizing that we do live in a world where the bad things happen.
So as sort of a continuation of that question, why would God create evil in the first place? For that measure, why would God create Satan? There's a Gnostic view of the demiurge, I'm sure you've heard of, where Satan actually made this world while God wasn't looking, which I've always found quite funny. How would you sort of rectify that? Because if God is omnimax, if he's omniscient, if all that, he knows what's going to happen. He would already predetermine this, so why set these conditions in a world that you've created? Why, he knows everything, he exists outside time and space, so it goes back to this Epicurus quote I'm sure you've heard. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he able, both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And it sort of comes into play of not the limitation of God's power, but rather why, if he can stop it, if he knows everything that's going to happen, why create it in the first place?
I would want to. That's a really tough question. I would want to say that God, who exists out of space and time, when he created the world, he set things in motion. God's not going to create something that is contrary to himself. So, for example, if he's going to give people free will, he's not going to suddenly intervene and take that away from people, because he's given that. In his goodness and his sovereignty, he's given that. Often a lot of us are like, why, Lord, did you even give us free will in the first place? Because we're doing a bad job with it.
Okay.
At the same time, God himself did not create evil. It's very hard to define where evil has come from. People blame it on Satan. As a matter of fact, when God did create Satan, as he is now known, he was originally created as an angel who lived in heaven with God and a bunch of others. But I guess angels have free will too. And so Satan decided to throw a rebellion. He led a rebellion and he got kicked out of heaven. Now where does the inclination to even rebel against God in free will come from? If you're going back to an original question, I have no idea. The Bible doesn't actually say that. What the Bible does say is that when God gives free will, it's so that people can choose on how they respond to him. They can choose how they react, and choose how they react to others and how they react to their world. Why Satan did what he did, you'll have to ask Satan that question. Why God lets there to be free will, I guess the best answer that the Bible gives is that God didn't want his creatures to be robots who moved when he said, who put a trampoline when he said jump.
Sure.
He wanted people to love him for him. It's sort of like if you love someone, you want them to love you back. You don't want them to love you because you force them to love you. That sort of a thing. That's what real relationship is. So it's to suggest that God creates evil, it's contrary to who God is in terms of his character. It would be like someone telling Laurie Daly, who's coach of the New South Wales Blues, that he created the Queensland Maroons. That doesn't make any sense. That makes no sense whatsoever. It would be like someone telling a physicist that they created botany.
Okay.
Those things do not equate with each other. I understand why people will think that there's something up with God because these things happen and he's supposed to be sovereign.
Yes.
But like I said in the previous question, these things can coexist, but to then blame God for something that he himself didn't do, it's a bit rich. You can't do that. Because there is evil, it doesn't mean that God is any less powerful. God has conquered evil. He has defeated evil. Though it is there, God has not let it win. He's kicked its butt, essentially.
So just to sort of understand that question better, is what you're saying is that God did not create evil, but as a Christian we can't know where evil actually cometh?
Yeah, I would say that. We can have confidence that God did not create evil because God is good. He's holy. He's just. The Bible tells us that there is nothing remotely wrong or evil with him. Our sinfulness is so bad, and that God couldn't handle it. So, if human like stupid stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis is enough to cause a break between us and God, I think it would be fair to say that what even us in our sinful nature would define as evil, there's no way God in any way, shape or form could have any responsibility over that or correlation.
No, that's great. All right, so is God on other planets? If not, what is the reason for the universe? What this means is the universe is so vast and so infinite. Why create it to have a single relationship with a single species on a single planet?
Sure. Well, I would have no issue if God in some way, shape or form interacted with other planets. The Bible doesn't say anything about alien life form. Okay. That's not to say that it does exist. Okay. But if it was, maybe there wasn't a need for us to know about it, or to be aware, or to be told explicitly about it. So, and I would like to think that even in some crazy way, shape or form, God does interact with the rest of his universe.
Excellent.
That there is something there. Now, in terms of humanity and life on Earth, the Bible makes it very clear that as humans are the pinnacle of God's creation, and so he wants a relationship with us. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't necessarily have a relationship with animals too. We know that in the Bible that there are many accounts where animals played a role in biblical narrative. An example would be Balaam and his donkey.
Yes.
The donkeys that Jesus encountered. The birds of the field that Jesus talks about. God has a special heart for animals and for nature as well. There are aspects in the Psalms, in wisdom literature, we talk about the trees that clap their hands for it. We know the trees don't have hands, so please don't interpret that literally. No, most people do not. But the idea that all things that are created, which were created by God, they are aware of Him in some way.
I see.
So while humanity definitely is the pinnacle of that creation, I believe deep down, and from what I have read in Scripture, that animals and all things that are created have an awareness of God.
Okay.
If, for sake of argument's sake, say there was a species of a four-legged herbivorean creature that lived on Jupiter.
Yep.
Since we believe that God created the universe and God created all things, this creature would know God, God would know this creature.
Okay.
I don't think such a view would be necessarily contrary to anything the Scripture says. We only know about human life form on this planet because that's all we were ever told about.
Sure.
In that respect, and we understand from the Genesis 1 account about land and sea, about moon, stars, and we have understood it to be in the context of the planet Earth.
Yes. Okay.
If there were other planets that had a similar thing, yay, that's awesome. But we just don't have the information. Neither does science, for that matter, about a definitive proof of such things. So.
Well,
yeah.
actually, they do. See, there's quite a few planets. They're called Goldilocks planets, and essentially it's the same sort of situation Earth has.
Oh, nice.
Yes, yeah. And some of them are actually better than Earth, just in terms of positioning. For instance, our sun will, I think it's obviously changed number, but it's roughly about 500,000 years is going to expand and basically wipe out the Earth.
Okay.
Now, I mean, I'm of the opinion that humans aren't really even going to last to see that. If we do, awesome. But with these Goldilocks planets, we have so many of them that are just perfectly centered around their sun. And some of those suns are very young. One planet, for instance, that I used in the last interview was Kepler 22b. It's actually bigger than the Earth. And from the looks of it, it actually looks like an almost ideal Earth. So with that being said, there is most likely, we could assume there is most likely life there that followed different evolutionary strains, that followed different evolutionary sort of pathways than we did. If that led to sentience, would you feel that discredits God more, or would you feel that sort of proves God?
I think since there is evidence for these things being there,
Yes.
if there was other life forms in the universe, be they human forms, animal forms, whatever forms,
Yes.
it wouldn't discredit God
Okay.
because God is creator. He creates all things. He created these planets. He created these universes. I don't think it would be the biggest challenge for him to create such things.
Yes.
I don't think. I don't think that it would necessarily. How much more it would actually prove the existence of God, I don't know, but it certainly wouldn't discredit him.
Okay. No, excellent. So, given God's behavior from a purely biblical standpoint,
Yeah.
what reason is there to worship him? From this being said, he seems to have a real sort of love for the Jewish people.
Yep.
But the Gentiles, although Paul sort of rectifies this later on, seem to sort of be thrown under the bus quite a lot.
Okay.
So as a Gentile, how would you sort of... Why worship a Jewish God? Why worship a God that prefers one singular race over all other races of humanity?
First of all, I'd want to say that as a human, we'd want to worship God because he's God.
Okay.
Because he's creator, because he's sovereign, and because he's boss.
Okay.
He is the God. So regardless of how you classify yourself as either being Camp Jew or Camp Gentile,
Yep.
or Camp something completely different, and neither is what you sit in,
Yep.
if you call yourself a human, you'd want to worship God because he's God. But more than just that, you want to worship God because of what He's done. See, when Jesus came to earth as the incarnate God, sure, He was born in a Jewish family. Sure, He came to the system. But the death that He died, it was for anyone who pretty much had red blood.
Okay.
So if you're a red-blooded creature and if you're human, Christ's death was for you. If you don't have a different color blood, well, I'm sure God has something else in plan for your salvation. But from a human standpoint, more than a Gentile standpoint, we've seen God do so many wonderful and awesome things. How could you not praise Him? How could you not worship Him? In terms of the Jewish component of it, which can be quite confusing and can be quite interesting, even before God called the Jewish people, saying and started the Jewish, I guess that the particular connection with that group of people.
Yep.
Back in Genesis 12, God had a love for all humanity. The covenants, like during the time of in Noah, of like say Genesis 6 and 7.
Sure.
That was a humanity thing. It wasn't necessarily about one group of people.
Okay.
God's covenant with humanity and the call that He has on them as being the Imago Dei, the image bearers of God, the call for them to be His stewards over the earth. That's like a worldwide, all ages time thing. If you're a human, so like put your hand up if you're a human being, you're part of that.
Okay.
The reason why God worked with the Jewish people in that way was because He wanted to show people what it would like to have a relationship with Him.
Yes.
The Jews were chosen in that respect to pretty much be that example.
Okay.
Now, God could have easily picked the Palestinians, He could have picked, the Arabs, He could have picked the Africans, He could have even picked Sri Lankans or Aussies or whatever.
Sure.
He picked these guys for some reason. If you want to know why specifically the Jews, that's a question you probably have to ask God when you meet Him.
Okay.
But regardless of who He picked, He chose a particular subgroup to give the example of what relationship with Him would look like. And the idea was that they would point out what a relationship with God would look like so that others would want in.
Yes.
Now, as much as they did some things really well, they did some things pretty bad as well.
Okay.
Which is where Jesus had to come and show what it was like to really be like the model, the prototype of what it is to be in a good relationship with God. Because of His sacrifice for all, it meant that anyone could do that. So now we no longer have the whole Gentile versus Jew debate. That was a debate back in the 1st century.
Yep.
Because you had people who were once known as the people who apparently were in relationship with God, yet which the whole entire world knew that they weren't doing properly themselves.
Sure.
Plus you had those who had all of a sudden, by an act of God, had been called to be in relationship with Him too. And they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we make this work? It'd be like if you have two countries that live next to each other side by side. Suddenly one day that dividing line is gone and they're all called to be together.
Sure.
How do you balance two cultures? How do you balance two different ways of life, sets of life and whatever? And that mix there. That's when you had this whole Jew-Gentile thing, and that was a big issue in the early church.
Yep.
For today, the idea is that it's like one church, the idea of one humanity, where God has revealed Himself to everybody, regardless of your race or your creed or your circumstance. God is your God.
Okay.
The differentiation is, do you choose to be in relationship with Him or not? It's not so much about I'm a Jew, therefore I'm here, I'm a Gentile. It's there. We hear in the Pauline epistles and even through the word of Jesus that the man-made laws that were there, they are no longer in place. The things that define the people, they're no longer there. What matters now is, where do you stand with God, the God of all humanity?
Okay. So if this is sort of a follow-on to that, but let's say this is anecdotal. Anecdotal at best. But would you be a Christian if you grew up in, say, 13th century China? So, in other words, do you think God chose you, or do you choose God? So being in that circumstance, i.e. the people who were around the Judaic tribe that had no way of knowing about Judah without knowing about Elohim and stuff like that, were they just not good enough? Were they... Why not them? Why not everybody on earth at one point? Why not why this select group of people in this select region?
Let's see. God is a God of progressive revelation throughout the scriptures. So as He revealed Himself to some in the Old Testament, He revealed Himself more to others in the New Testament.
Okay.
I would also want to say that at the same time that God revealed Himself, there are people who are non-Jewish people who came to know Him and who wanted in.
Okay.
And God honored that faith. An example would be some of the ladies who are part of Jesus' genealogy, who you read about in Matthew chapter 1.
Yes.
There are other encounters where God has engaged with strictly non-Jews, and they came to faith. But the progressive revelation was very much that. In terms of the question of is it God or is it us, I believe it's both.
Okay.
So the Bible makes it very clear that God seeks relationship.
Yes.
And he works to have relationship with people. To say is that it is all God, which I know a lot of Christians will hold on to and say, I appreciate that and I get that God reveals himself. However, people also have to respond as well.
Okay.
This is not a case of roboting or whatever. If someone chooses to not want to have anything to do with God, that's on them, because God has made himself known. There are times when in the New Testament where Jesus has healed people, where he talked to people, where they encountered him, people who actually got to see him flesh and blood and engage with him, people who saw God, who saw God at work, who engaged and encountered him, yet they chose to not engage with God, not be in relationship with him.
Okay.
You can't put it down to God. That was their choice as well. I said earlier that if you are seeking God, seek him and he will reveal himself to you. God often gives us the desire to seek after him because as humans, we know that there is a God out there.
Okay.
We know that on the inside, even though there are things that they'll try and tell us that there is no God, deep down we all know, because we are created in his image, that God is real.
Okay.
And so when we seek out for God, he honors our seeking. So it's very much a two-way partnership sort of a thing. I totally believe, along with a lot of my more highly reformed co-heirs in Christ, that God definitely plays a part in this. You will not hear me say otherwise.
Okay.
However, I also do believe that there is a level of human responsibility, and that the two of them are there interconnected in intention.
Yes.
Like I talked about science and theology before, it's a bit like that here as well. The specific question about the 13th century about Chinese. If someone is called to be in a relationship with God, God will make himself known to them.
Okay.
There are plenty of accounts, even in 21st century, all over the world, where maybe an unreached people group or someone who maybe grew up in a very oppressive, anti-Christian regime, where one day God just revealed themselves to him, but they also then had to make a choice to actually respond to that.
Okay.
So, to say, I mean, as much as it's good to be thinking and wrestling with ideas about why doesn't God reveal himself everywhere and all the rest of it, God has. He revealed himself through Jesus. He keeps making himself revealed and known. But people also have to respond to that.
So
and people are called to seek after him too.
So although that he's revealed himself to the world, what about those he does not? So, for instance, I've heard of people who have quite literally sat there praying for hours and hours on end and nothing. Are they just not good enough? Does God not hate them, but does God hate them? Or are they simply not good enough? And by extension, why were they created in the first place? Was it just to suffer? Was it just to be rebuked? Because if God's omniscient, he already knows what's going to happen to them.
Sure.
So why create them in the first place?
I think to hold such a view, which I know regrettably some Christians do, in terms of how they have understood aspects of theology, I think personally it is a very irresponsible and a very dangerous view to take, because the value of humanity in and of itself is such that it is greater than the animals. The Bible says it's crowned just a little bit lower than the angels. Everyone has a purpose, everyone has a story. That's why Christians get up in arms about stuff like abortion and euthanasia and the dignity of people, because we intrinsically believe in the rights and the value of people for being people.
Yes.
So I want to affirm that first of all.
Okay.
God has never made anything that was a waste.
Okay.
So to say that someone was to even suggest someone was like a waste of space, literally, or waste of a soul, I think it's an insult to them, but it's an insult also to God, because he doesn't make anything for it to be a waste.
Just this thing. If they're not a waste, and it's an insult to them, they were quite literally created then just to go to hell.
Not necessarily. We're getting into some of the more deeper levels of theology. There are some Christians, and I can understand where they're coming from in terms of how they've structured their argument, where if you're not called to know God, you're pretty much a reprobate. Okay. You're like wasted humanity, and I'm very uncomfortable with that very personally, because I really do believe that God gives everyone an opportunity to know him and to respond to him.
Okay.
If people choose not to respond, and look, there is a level of human responsibility in this as well, as much as there is the sovereignty of God, and that's where the kicker is. God will not waste his time creating someone if he knew that without even him trying to engage with them or him trying to even have a relationship with them, it wouldn't work out.
Okay.
If that makes any sense. I think as much as God knows what's going to happen, it's sort of like it's sort of like the idea that if you see a car wreck that's going to happen, say 100, like 2 kilometers down the line, you see it happening, you know it's going to happen. Would you not just do whatever you could between now and then to make some sort of a change, some sort of an impact? Or would you be like, no, it's going to happen, I'm just going to turn my back and walk away?
Okay.
God is that person who every step of the way, if you use that same analogy, who has intervened and tried to get that person's attention, tried to pursue them in love, but people also have to respond. So look, there are people there who will not go know God and will therefore be separate from him forever. That sucks. I say that as much as a Christian, but as much as a human as well, because we want to know what our purpose is. We want to know what we're created for. I don't believe God creates anyone just so that they will just go straight to hell. That is so inconsistent with the character of God. That is inconsistent with who Jesus is. As much as the Bible does talk about the sovereignty of God, there's also things about people also have to respond in faith as well.
Okay.
There is that real tension there. So, I mean, I don't know if that necessarily clarifies too many things, but
no, that's fine.
I hope it does.
As I said, these aren't really debates. These are more just getting honest opinions from people. So that's perfectly viable.
I would, as much as there are people who can probably back it up with different like Bible verses and whatever, I would challenge any Christian who really knew God and really knew what grace was and really knew what it was to be a person who was pursued by God and who come to faith in him, however you reckon that may have happened.
Okay.
To actually get up and tell someone, you were created to go to hell, you were created for nothing.
Yes.
Because all of us are human, all of us are sinful, all of us are fallen.
Okay.
Any of us are only saved by the grace of God. So none of us have the right to go putting that argument on someone else and saying that they mean nothing or anything.
Yes. We have Westboro for that.
We have no right. We have no right. If you're down with Jesus, then you should be doing everything you can to encourage those around you to see Jesus, to know Jesus as you shine his light.
Okay. So if you compare the stories, this is where I get good, because although I'm very novice at science, I do love some comparative religion and historical text. So if you compare the stories of Noah with Ziusudra, stories sort of near identical. There's also others like Adam and Enkidu in the Babylonian verse. Oh man, this has so many M's and N's. You know what? Doesn't matter. Yeah. I'm just going to move on to the next one.
Go for it.
Chapter 125 of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Excellent book, by the way. I have that on my bookshelf right now and finished it a couple months ago. Is, I wouldn't say identical to the Ten Commandments, but quite a lot of the core essentials are still there. So there's quite a lot of historical figures, for instance, that align with these events in the Bible. With that being said, do you feel that that's a promotion of the Bible, or rather is that a stumbling block? Do we even need to rectify that? Do Christians need to answer these questions? So,
I think any religion, any belief system that anyone can subscribes by, there'll be laws and regulations that are attached to that fit that context and whatever.
I see.
So, I mean, look, every religion has rules. The issue is where is the role of those rules within it? So, for example, the Ten Commandments was given to the Israelites so that they would know how to live in a way that pleased God, but also served a double purpose to show that they would actually not be necessarily able to keep those laws, that they would need more. It was just more than just being a law keeper.
Yes.
Which you see manifested more in the New Testament, but that's another story for another day.
Okay.
Even for Christians, in terms of the laws that we keep, Jesus has abolished the laws of the Old Testament so that while they were good for a purpose in and of themselves, we are no longer bound to them. Now that doesn't mean we start, sleeping around and murdering people or dishonoring our parents or not keeping the Sabbath or any of those other things. But at the same time, the role now has a different purpose altogether. We are under the covenant of grace. So therefore we are under a different system. But inevitably, I would want to also say that with Christianity, it isn't so much about laws or keeping them or trying to keep someone else's laws.
Sure.
But it's about relationship.
Okay. So let's get into some sort of hypotheticals. First, if your child was of another faith, how would you deal with this?
I wouldn't love them any less.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Because they're my child.
Yes.
I'd be disappointed, sure, because I've seen God at work in my own life. I know who God is. And I would hope and pray that my kids would share that same faith as well.
Okay.
And all I could do then at that point is to love them, to support them, and to be praying for them every day that God will reveal himself to them. You can't force someone to be a Christian. You can't make someone a Christian. And no one can piggyback off someone else's faith. Your faith has to be your own.
Okay.
So in that respect, you would just be praying that God would reveal himself to them, that they would know God for themselves. You never give up. You never stop praying for people who don't come to faith. I've had cousins who have converted to Islam. I've had friends who grew up in the church who have walked away and they're like, nah, this makes no sense.
Okay.
You don't stop praying for those people. You don't stop asking God to reveal himself to them, to make himself known to them in their own context, in what's going on in their life.
Sure.
So that they will know him. Because God is not one who gives up on people, so we shouldn't either.
Okay. So by extension, if commanded by Yahweh to do something as abhorrent as what Abraham did, or we can even extend that to another. Let's say you're Joshua standing there and you've been told to genocide a people. Would you do this? Would you follow God's command without question?
I think those are very dangerous examples, and this is not an insult towards the person who actually asked the question. The reason I say that is because, first and foremost, as a Christian, I believe that what God says is a good thing, it's a holy thing. He will not ask anything bad. Now, I know that might sound ridiculous given the example, especially in the Joshua situation. As Christians, we're called to trust God and to move where he guides us. That's what we're taught to do. And we're encouraged to follow God as best as we can. The idea that how we respond to what he calls us to do is a reflection of our faith.
Okay.
The Abraham story is one that troubles me. I would like to meet a Christian that isn't completely troubled or traumatized by that story.
Yep. Because
it is very messed up. It's very confronting. I can understand how it can be a stumbling block for people. Especially when you look at the context that this was the chosen child, the promised child. I think in that particular situation, without doing a huge amount of exegesis on the passage, doing a lot of in-depth study on the passage.
Sure.
I think the idea was that Isaac was so loved by Abraham as the promised child. God wanted Abraham to go through such a grueling test, which maybe he thought only Abraham could handle, because I don't think he would have asked David or anyone else to do a similar test.
Sure.
Just so that Abraham could understand how much this child would mean in relationship to his relationship with God.
Okay.
Sort of like a test to see, like, do you love this child more than God?
Okay.
And I think, but it also serves as a foreshadow to show that, as awful a thing it is, I don't think we can say that God is mean or vindictive for even suggesting such an abhorrent thing. But it also served to show that even something as a father killing their own child, their own heir, as messed up and as awful as it is, which thankfully Abraham did not have to do, yet God himself did.
Okay.
He sent his own son to be killed, which is, for lack of a better phrase, insane in the membrane, because you will never hear any other deity of any other religion who would value people or value creation so much that they would kill their own child to bring about their creation's well-being. So I mean, that story, it serves as a forerunner to that, to show something as crazy that yet God himself would do for his people. In terms of the Joshua situation, do you need me to stop?
No, keep going.
Sorry. In terms of the Joshua situation, from memory, these were people who did not love God, did not honor God, were indulging in a lot of really messed up stuff, where other people were getting hurt, where other people were being treated so badly, and they were like a real stain on the system. They were like probably the equivalent of what ISIS is, if something not more.
Okay.
So it could have, if I remember correctly, I don't think God told Joshua to kill these guys just for the kicks or just or just for his own amusement. God does not work that way. But I think he told Joshua to do that as an act of judgment, to be like, you know what, this is so messed up,
Sure.
it cannot reign anymore. Now, that's not to say that God, in maybe some sort of behind the scenes sort of way, had not warned them, had not told them, do not do this displeases me. But God is also God who will bring about judgment. He even brings judgment on his own people. You'll see in the Old Testament that there were times when his people were carried into exile, were made prisoners of foreign kingdoms because they lived in disobedience to God, and they were warned countless times. I don't think God likes to see anyone get killed. But these are things where, because we only see one snapshot of one story, we can't see the big picture. But God cares, and we've got to trust him. Sometimes it's really hard. Okay. Sometimes it makes no sense, but that's what we're called to do.
All right. So if you became an atheist right now, how would your life change?
My life would be very different in the sense that it would just be me.
Okay.
There would be no one else I'd have to answer to. There'd be no one else that I would rely on for help. In my inmost being, it would be a very different existence. It'd be a bit more of a solitary existence. I think it'd really suck. And like, no disrespect to all the atheists out there.
No, that's fine.
But I guess knowing how awesome it is to have God in my life and how that impacts in my life and things, it would really stink to not have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
Are we able to wrap up the question?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say we'll wrap up now. So anyway, at the end of these, since we're running out of time, I just ask somebody if there's anything they need to plug, anything they'd like to plug, a church, a video, a book, a movie. God's Not Dead 2 coming out. Alicia Silverstone or whatever. She was Sabrina. Melissa Joan Hart, that's it. Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or Clarissa, if you're into that. Personally, I preferred Clarissa. Explains it all much better.
There are a lot of really great books and resources out there.
Mm-hmm.
I would tell anyone who's seeking and who's looking, like I said, for ask God to show you what to read. Easy to do would be just to plug Bible and say, yeah, just read it. Start with the Gospel, maybe Matthew, maybe Luke, maybe John. But there are people who probably would be like, that's the last thing I'm going to do is pick up a Bible. Like, they'll probably be like, no freaking way. Ask God to show you what to read. Ask God to show you what to watch.
Okay.
Because someone's story, it may not necessarily be what would bring me to Christ, but it might bring someone else's.
Okay.
There are so many good books and resources, DVDs, CDs, all the rest of it out there. But yeah, different people will work for different people, so ask God to guide you. And
from my theistic friends, I've been told by an amazing guy named Hermes the Messenger to go to talkorigins.org, which is a response to creationist theories about evolution. That clears up some things. Anyway, thanks for being here, and thanks for letting me interview you.
No worries.
All right, over and out, and thanks for listening to The Mind of a Theist.